Hi, everybody. Before we can really get into the actual course material per se, I think it's kind of important that I give you a little bit of a background here, kind of a way to. I mean, we'll talk about the history of IO psychology as a separate lecture here, but I wanted to give you a context in which to put this thing called IO psychology because it is a relatively new discipline, for lack of a better word, but it most certainly didn't emerge out of anything. So I just kind of want to give you, and this is kind of a history of psychology in 10 to 12 minutes. So take it for what it is. If you go back, in the history of science or before science, of course, philosophy, you find that Plato and Aristotle were the two bigwigs back in the day, right? They were the two major philosophers. And I'm going to summarize these two major philosophers in an incredibly short fashion. Plato, for all practical purposes, said, look, if you want to know truth, the only truth that there is to be found is in the heavens. Because take a look, for example, you want to know what is the truth of a dog or something like what is a dog? And Plato would say, take a look. Every single dog is different. Some have dark fur, light fur, spots, etc., etc. Plato says the problem is all of these different dogs are just a representation of the perfect dog. And so, if you want to know what a dog is, you can't really look at any one here on earth. Instead, you need to kind of look to the heavens. Because the truth of a dog or any other concept, the truth of any concept, can never be found on earth because of all of this variability. So instead, if you want to know the truth, you look to the heavens and find the truth. He had some other crazy thoughts. I mean, Plato said, before you were born, your soul lived in the heavens and it dwelt among these perfect forms, and therefore your soul knows the answer. And so the only way that you will ever find, quote, truth is by turning inside yourself and looking into your soul, because your soul knows the answer. So now this kind of wacky thing became the foundation of rationalism. Okay, rationalism again. I mean, I'm not getting into a huge history thing, but rationalism, which basically uses the nature approach to development. That is, when animals or humans are born, we're born with all kinds of traits and characteristics that describe who we are. Aristotle, on the other hand, was a little different. In fact, Aristotle set up the very first university. Aristotle thought, okay, if you want to know the truth, your job is to go out and look empirically to see. Go out and empirically look at as many dogs in the world as you can possibly find and find what they have in common. Aha, four legs, tail, fur, tongue. I don't know what the hell they have in common, but you look at hundreds of dogs, find out what they have in common, average these dogs somehow, and the average is the truth. Okay? And this is an interesting approach. I mean, according to Aristotle, you don't look at one dog, to get the truth. You look at five, maybe. 10, getting better. 100,000, million, okay? And this is what Aristotle's university, the Lyceum, was all about, was just taking many observations to access the truth, okay? And so this idea becomes the basis of the empirical philosophies, right? The major empiricists, of course, John Locke, many others, but empirical philosophy, and again, which takes more of a nurture approach. That is to say that who you are is much more a function of the environment that you've been raised in, something like this. Okay, so this is background to where science comes from. And so these two competing philosophies that dominated academia, empiricism and rationalism. And so what happens is Francis Bacon. Okay, Francis Bacon did a lot of cool stuff. This guy was pretty awesome. And he realized that you could put these two competing philosophies together. They didn't have to fight against each other. They could be used together. And so he creates this new thing, a brand new invention called science. Okay? And with science, what he said is you use rationalism to generate a theory. Okay? You create a theory by turning inside of yourself and you look at the observation. You go, I think the reason that that happened is, and my theory is, and therefore I hypothesize, etc. Then, once you've designed your research, and we'll talk more about this in topic 2, once you've designed your research, use empiricism to test them. You generate observations, you measure, you manipulate, you measure, and so then you use empiricism to generate, rationalism to test. Whoops, flip that. Rationalism to generate theories, empiricism to test. Okay? So now Francis Bacon was a great guy. I loved him. I mean, by the way, I looked it up on Wikipedia the other day because I was curious to remember the story. But Francis Bacon, this is perhaps a rumor, but Francis Bacon dies because he's riding home in a carriage in the freezing weather and he gets struck with a sudden inspiration. Okay, so and he's got to test his theory. So what happens is he's got this theory that cold can preserve meat. Okay? So he stops by some peasant's house. He buys a chicken, right? They pay the peasant to gut the chicken. Then he stuffs it with snow, and then they measure him and I don't remember who he's with. They were measuring the effects of decomposition on the chicken that's stuffed with snow. I mean, it's a good study, right? Meanwhile, though, he catches pneumonia, right? Because he's out in the cold like an idiot stuffing a chicken with snow. And he dies from pneumonia from stuffing a chicken with snow. All right, whatever. It's a good story, but totally off to the side, so don't get distracted. Okay. So anyway, Francis Bacon, the father of science, says very, very, very clearly, science should change the world for the better. Okay? The goal of science is to make the world better. And I can't emphasize that enough. That is the goal of science. Okay? I want to put that out there because as I'm going through different lectures in IO psychology, you will hear a lot of cynicism coming from me. I will not be able to bite my tongue. And I'm going to step right back to this. The goal of science is to make the world better. I unfortunately feel many, not all, there are many, many perfectly wonderful people in IO Psych, but many people in IO Psych, it is my opinion that the almighty dollar is far more important than any human considerations, right? Any attempt to make the world better is perhaps not in their priority system. Okay, so later on, say for example, we'll talk about job satisfaction, and from one side, oh, wouldn't it be great if your employees are satisfied? But from my cynical perspective, satisfied employees make you more money. I mean, they don't care about the customer, they don't care about. I got to be careful, bite my tongue. I'm just telling you why later on, when you hear my cynicism, fundamentally where it comes from, and it's Francis Bacon right here. Now, Francis Bacon did also say some other interesting things that are relevant for us. Francis Bacon said that experiment or research, or you know, in fact, how about this? When science was first created, nobody knew what to do with it. They didn't understand what it was. They were like, is this a type of philosophy? Is this a new religion? What are we supposed to do with this thing? And it took a long time for Francis Bacon to explain, no, this is just a new way of generating knowledge. I mean, it's not necessarily having to compete with philosophy or religion. It's just a different way. You know, there's 3 different ways to generate knowledge: religion, philosophy, and science. So anyway, cool stuff. But he says, look, science will furnish knowledge to improve technology. He says there should be 2 types of experiments done. I love these. I'll try to do my Latin for you. Experimenta lucifera and experimenta fructifera. I have no idea how to speak Latin. Just pretend I did, right? And so what happens is he says, look, scientists should perform basic research to find out the fundamental laws of the universe, find the fundamental principles that drive things. But then, later on, it's understanding these basic principles is critical. But if you want to make the world a better place, and that is the fundamental reason that science exists, you have to do the second part, applied research, or the experiments of fruit here. Because it is only when you take these basic principles that you learn with basic research and use them to solve a real world problem that science does what it's supposed to do. So now, science was a beautiful thing running up through the 1700s. 1700s, 1800s, a scientist is a, quote, scientist. It's not until, say, the late mid 1860s or something, that Wilhelm Wundt starts the first experimental research laboratory in psychology, and psychology emerges as a separate discipline in the world of science. Okay, well, what happened is around the turn of the century, the major psychologist in the field was Edward Titchener. He was a very dominant character, and I mean, I'm not teaching history psych per se, but he was a dominant person. He firmly believed, by the way, in much more of a rationalistic perspective. He was much more, if you want to find the truth, you should introspect, turn inside yourself. Another class I'll rant on how Titchener's a son of a bitch, but for today we'll just let Titchener go. But the idea is that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there is this belief that basic research is somehow good and pure. Okay, that is to say, let me give you an interesting example. Here it is in the 21st century. Who gets more respect? The engineer that designs the automobile or the auto mechanic that fixes it? And it's pretty straightforward. The basic researcher, the one that is at the front end, gets far more respect than the one that's at the back end solving problems. And this was the overriding mindset in the late 1900s, whatever, late 1800s, late 19th century. That's all confusing. And so what happened was Titchener and others felt that if you were to apply the discipline of psychology, it would somehow pollute that thing. It would somehow turn it impure or like a working man's kind of thing all of a sudden. But what happened was that universities started to step into psychology departments and says, dudes, we've been funding you for a bunch of years. When are you going to start paying back? Okay? And so whether Titchener wanted it or not, he fought real hard against it. He claimed, oh, we're not ready for this. But the fact is, he didn't want to pollute his pure discipline. But these universities came out and said, look, give us something we can work with. So this is really the background before we can even talk about applications of psychology, and IO psychology is, of course, an application of psychology. So we'll pick up the history of IO psychology from this point where people such as Titchener fought very hard to keep psychology from becoming an applied discipline, but economics required that it would become so.